is another episode of Thorin's Platform, and my guest for this one is going to be brownbear, and he is someone who specializes in articulating, exploring, discussing RTS game design, which sounds like an incredibly arcane topic, but I actually think is one that personally I find very interesting, because so much discussion goes on in RTS games, even more so than any other game type I'm actually aware of, constantly about things like balance, and then within the context of balance, an obvious corollary always becomes, how should we actually design these components? And so one of the most famous kind of hot points for this discussion has been the entire lifehood of StarCraft 2, because StarCraft 2 was all about the idea of trying to build a bigger base for StarCraft when it came out, and therefore you see some of the design choices they made, and then obviously has ceded ground to other games in the esports space and isn't as big a game itself now. So now people have the questions of, like, should they go back to being more of a hardcore community? Obviously now you see Brood War Remastered has come back, Koreans play Brood War again, so now I notice a lot of the people who were very much converts to StarCraft 2, even among the casters, magically have remembered what a great game Brood War is and how some of them prefer that now that they're casting it. So it's definitely an interesting area, but the reason I'm bringing up the relevance of this is that actually most discussion around that topic is basically just incredibly layman level sort of spitballing of ideas. Like, it's one thing for someone to say something like, oh, you should get rid of multiple building selection. Like, I would say that as a layman, because just in the very simple things I know, it seems reasonable. But I don't actually know anything about the decision choices that went into why that ever existed in the first place, or why they changed later. And then, crucially, I only know Brood War, maybe a tiny bit of Warcraft, and then StarCraft 2. I don't have any other games to reference, whereas one of the things I think's very good about your work is because you all have the Age of Empires background, you have extra additional points, and crucially, they don't have to be StarCraft 2 or Brood War, so they don't necessarily divide people in the same way. And so I wanted... The piece that inspired me to do this interview was this piece that you did late last year, where basically the title of the piece was StarCraft 2 and Brood War belong to different genres, which is obviously, I wouldn't say a controversial, but it's quite a compelling title, because people are immediately going to think, what does that mean? I mean, they're both just RTS games. Obviously, Brood War and StarCraft 2 have, like, the same races in them. They clearly have a direct lineage in the lore, and even in some of the elements of the game design. So we're not going to go through every element of this article. It's a very good article. It's quite in-depth. People can read it. But just to start the topic out, let's start with the premise of this article. So when you said that, when you say they're different genres, now you don't literally mean they're different as in how different an FPS is from an RTS. So just give us a condensed version. Why are StarCraft 2 and Brood War different genres?
Sure. When I think about one of the most important things, I think, in game design is who is intended to be kind of the target audience for this game, and what is the experience that you're trying to convey to the users who play this game. And I think one of the most brilliant kind of observations about Brood War and StarCraft 2 as different games is that Brood War is a mechanical game with strategic components, and StarCraft 2 is a strategy game with mechanical components, in the sense that they both contain these elements and they're both real-time strategy games, but they have a very different user experience due to a difference in what they emphasize. So Brood War, for example, tends to emphasize very basic macro and micromanagement, whereas StarCraft 2 tends to favor more, I guess you could say, advanced or complicated macro or micromanagement. And then it streamlines some of the things that were hard in Brood War with features like multiple building select or unlimited unit selection.
Okay. So one of the things I actually found a little bit, maybe it was just, it either seemed like too obtuse a point, or maybe I didn't get it quite, but when you were talking about, like, as we mentioned, one of the first things that you just referenced now is multiple building selection. So basically, a simple version of that for people listening who have played any of these games is we're basically talking about how easy do you make the economical component of the game, because a game like Brood War is famously difficult because you have to select each of the buildings and you have to make sure that each of them is producing things, and you can't just hotkey them all and then produce all your whatever basic unit it might be from one button press. So obviously, think logically about how a game continues. The later you go in the game, the more bases you have, the more armies, the more potential engagements, the less economical mechanical restrictions you have of having to click each of the buttons as opposed to just hotkeying one is obviously going to make that, as you say, streamlined. Like, you're not really going to have any edge there, and therefore the emphasis will be placed in the other areas. Now, a question I have along these lines is, in this actual article, you quote a Dustin Browder quote from early in StarCraft 2, where he's talking about gas in this respect, so the Vespene geysers. And he makes a very weird point that, this is why I wanted to ask, like, for you to clarify something. So you made the point that they didn't necessarily do these moves to casualize the game. Like, if someone like me, again, a complete layman, but who's played these games and is an expert only in as much as I have a lot of experience. Like, I definitely wouldn't be acclaimed to be an expert about game design elements. But if I was explaining to someone, I actually would have said about multiple building design and things like this, and workers just sort of being quite efficient, I would actually tell someone, oh no, this is to casualize the game. This is to water the game down in order to try and get more people through the door, so that there's not kind of like such a learning curve restriction that makes people who are newer players go, oh, this is crap. Like, this is because obviously, famously, these elements, while as you describe them as easy, they're very boring to a lot of people. You know, they might be fun once you realize how they add up and you can sort of build a cumulative edge on someone. But as a newer player, they're going to be considered quite boring. And as a result, just as, you know, people who speak English don't spend a lot of their time brushing up on the fundamentals, a lot of newer players aren't going to want to do this. They're just going to stick with whatever they're fairly bad at. So in the quote from Dustin Browder, what I didn't understand was he seems to suggest both ends of the equation simultaneously. Because on the one hand, he says that, I'll actually go and find the quote if I can, just so I can quickly reference part of it. Okay, here we go. So at first he says that he doesn't want it to be where people who are newer are severely disadvantaged, presumably by having some kind of a some kind of mechanical component to being able to harvest gas, because his feeling there is that people want to get to the really strong units. By the way, this is a total sidebar, but I think he's absolutely wrong in that sense. Like, I don't think new players are going, fuck, I must have battle cruisers. But okay, that's Dustin Browder's world. We'll accept his worldview for this moment. And he's suggesting that he doesn't want it to be too difficult to mine the gas, because he wants these casual players to be able to get to these, like, you know, the ultimate items, the most expensive items, the flashiest items in the game. But then at the same time, he doesn't want to make it where people who were but at the same time, the other reason is, like, he doesn't want it to be a mechanical component, because then people who are very good at micro would then get themselves to the really powerful items. Like, what can you explain the premise of what you meant by this? Because, I mean, it sounds to me like one thing you did, like, I don't know why you did this balancing act in this article, so this will tie into it, but you do seem to very, very carefully tread the line that you never try to cast any kind of qualitative judgment on what is better. So can you expound your thoughts on this particular topic?
Sure. Well, one of the reasons that I didn't want to do, like, the kind of the motivation that I had for writing this article was that there is this, like, religious war, I think, between people who really love StarCraft 2 and people who really love Brood War. And I wanted to better understand why. And I've seen this happen in multiple other genres. Like, I think it happened in Dark Souls. I think it happened in Banjo-Kazooie. But I've also seen games change pretty fundamentally, like Age of Empires 2 to Age of Mythology to Age of Empires 3, and not have this kind of fight emerge. And so when I was studying and trying to figure out, like, why is there this religious war? Why do people feel this way? I eventually concluded from my research and from playing the game that I think it comes down to player experience, and I think it comes down to the way that the games are designed. And so the approach that I wanted to take with this piece is I want anyone to be able to read this piece, whether they're a fan of StarCraft 2 or a fan of Brood War, and I want them to read this piece and think about why they like the game that they do, or maybe why they don't like the game that they don't like, and realize maybe that it's not a question of which game is necessarily better or worse. It's a question of the games ultimately serve different target audiences, and they try to do different things, and it's okay to like one and not like the other. And just because they're both named StarCraft, and just because they reuse the same intellectual property, it doesn't mean that you have to like both, and it's perfectly okay to dislike one. I think that what Dustin was, I think the core essence of what Dustin is getting at in his quote is the struggle that they had in the design between kind of accessibility and difficulty. Is that, on the one hand, I think that they wanted to make StarCraft 2 an accessible and kind of mainstream game that anyone could pick up and start playing, and it wouldn't be this kind of niche game where, like, I'm sorry?
Sure, keep going.
Oh, sure. It wouldn't be like this kind of like niche game where only like people who play it a lot can, like, it takes a really long time to get into it. But on the same note, when you look at other interviews, they place this enormous amount of emphasis on putting like the quote that David Kim always says is, people have their careers on the line when I make a change to StarCraft 2, and I really want to respect that. They also talk about, I think they said, like, the first time they watched Korean pro gamers play Brood War, they were like, oh, they were tearing up, and it meant so much to them. And so I think basically they wanted to achieve this, making the game very accessible and mainstream, and yet they also wanted to identify a method of skill differentiation which would enable the top tier players to still differentiate themselves in a rational way that didn't require constant input from the designer, but would still be accessible to new players.
Okay. So in the scenario where we have this Dustin Browder quote, and you talked about, like, you make this point that the emphasis shifts to the strategy element because, again, like, you're not going to micro buildings and units in terms of your economy. That's kind of going to take care of itself. Coupled with the fact that you make a very shrewd point, I think, later, which we'll definitely get into, is the next point, actually, about how this actually promotes in StarCraft, because you can stay on fewer bases and you don't oversaturate the workers in the same way. You essentially can turtle. It's not even turtle in the traditional sense, because, again, if someone comes from Brood War, they're going to think, what, you just choosing to only bunker down? It's more like there's just no reason. It's just disincentivized to expand. You're not necessarily actively choosing. You don't need to, you know. So in this world, right, even though you used all this terminology, like I say, like emphasize, etc., I have to ask you this question. I think this is the tough question in the interview. Okay, so be prepared for this one. One of the things I actually have always been a little bit tilted by whenever this discussion happens of Brood War versus StarCraft 2 is, right, let's say, first of all, I eliminate the people who it's clear have only played StarCraft 2 or have barely played StarCraft 2 and therefore are ludicrously biased and perhaps aren't even informed, you know, and are just going off like very hot take sort of like first impressions, you know, they haven't dug down to the nuance. When I actually listen to the people who have experience in both games, StarCraft 2 and Brood War, I always hear this narrative kind of outlined, which is somewhat similar to what you said in your article, but you didn't go as hard on it, okay? Which is it's the line of, like, StarCraft 2 is more strategical in the context that it's about making key strategy decisions at the key moments, and that probably will largely decide the game. Whereas Brood War is about economical management, micro, etc. But the part that I always find a bit confusing is people seem to try to polarize it too much for my money. Like, they try to make it sound like, right, Brood War's the game where it's about mechanics and it's about economy, and then StarCraft's the game that's about, like, the timing of the engagement and cost-efficient trading. Whereas what I never understood about that, again, please correct me if you think this is wrong, but for me, the reason why I get a bit frustrated is because I feel like Brood War is actually the game where it isn't structured in such a rigid manner. Like StarCraft 2 almost certainly is that way. Like, we've seen through all the updates, all the different expansions, all the different tech changes that people have had in the meta, it basically is that. It's just different variants of that. And then you have some cheese elements in it, but every sort of mid to late game plays out in this similar kind of ABC manner. Whereas actually in Brood War, for me, I always saw that as a game where almost every type of style could succeed. So yes, you certainly could use this one, like, kind of style that doesn't exist in StarCraft 2, but for my money, you could play every style in Brood War. You could have timing attacks, and you could play off one base in some sort of a manner as you're describing here. If you had some special ability to always pick the right competition and read the game, you could obviously play just macro style. I think if you look at the greatest players in Brood War, they run the whole gamut of these different styles and strengths, you know, whereas actually, if you look at StarCraft 2, I think generally they are a bit more narrow in kind of the frame of what makes the best players. What are your thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, so I think that, like, if you look at the way that I think about it is kind of the way that the games develop and the kind of diminishing returns in where you spend your time. So like you mentioned, StarCraft 2 has this almost this sense of being like constructed, right? Like the different strategies and the way they counter each other and the different styles you're intended to play. It almost seems like it's set up by the designer to work that way. Whereas in Brood War, maybe it feels a little bit more flexible and there's more options that are available to you. The reason that I personally tend to think of StarCraft 2 as the more quote-unquote strategic game is because of the way that diminishing returns work. Is that one of the things that you see in Brood War that's different from StarCraft 2 is that Brood War, because there is so much depth in the mechanical control of units, and because there are so few diminishing returns in your mechanical ability, you can improve your way out of like virtually any situation, because the skill ceiling in any given interaction is so high, sure, and the rewards of playing better are kind of increased proportionally with that. Whereas in StarCraft 2, when you get into these like weird moments where the meta is messed up or the balance is messed up, it tends not to self-correct. Like there needs to be some input from the designer to change kind of the strategic balance of the game, yes, because players cannot use their mechanics to improve their way out of a situation. And
so once you're in a certain situation, it's a bit more kind of cookie cutter as to what the options for both people are.
Exactly. And I think Stukio actually wrote a great article about this, because I think Innovation gave an interview, and he said that one of the reasons that he preferred StarCraft 2 was because he found StarCraft 2 to be more mechanical than Brood War. And I remember thinking about that, like, really, like, what does he mean by that? And I kind of get it. It's like in StarCraft 2, StarCraft 2 is in some ways more strategic because of the nature, because of the kind of like diminishing returns. Like you cannot improve your way mechanically out of a situation, and so you kind of end up playing these fixed, I guess, styles. It's kind of, I guess you could describe it as cookie cutter, but I think it's more complex than that. And so you end up playing these like different strategic styles that have kind of been designed by the designer, and then you innovate around kind of that structure that's been created. Does that kind of make sense?
Okay, then expand the last part. What do you mean? Like, can you think of like a hypothetical example? How would you innovate around what otherwise, might be kind of streamlined? Choose your adventure style. Like, well, he's done this, so I can do B or C. What kind of how does the player kind of navigate around that so they're not just on the rails all the time?
Well, I think there was this period in the end of the season last year in StarCraft 2 where it kind of felt, I think Artursis made this comment, that it kind of felt like every player had their own fingerprint. Every player would emphasize different, like they would often open in very similar ways, but they would diverge slowly in the different build order choices that they made and the different reactions that they had to what their opponents were doing. Because StarCraft 2's balance changes so regularly, and because its design now changes like once a year in a very radical way, players, like the correct quote unquote reactions to different playstyles are not ever like really figured out because they're constantly changing. And so you see different players reacting to different situations in very different ways. And so like Gumiho to me stands out as a good example of a mech player who took like this situation where swarm hosts were considered to be very dominant in the matchup, and he came up with this idea of using Thors and Vikings together to basically counter that, and he ended up winning the GSL using that style. And what I really appreciate about the way that Gumiho plays is that Gumiho, again, opens in generally the standard ways of most Terran players, but then he kind of like silently diverges. Like he'll build a factory here instead of like an extra factory here, or he'll build a tech lab here instead of a reactor, and he'll make like slightly different decisions. And he's not winning necessarily because he's playing mechanically better. He's winning because he's making these small diversions in his build to adopt kind of a superior strategic approach. Okay.
Right. Okay. Let me ask you this question then. So, is it not the case that by streamlining mechanical components, something about StarCraft 2, I mean, you can tell me this, but it feels inarguable, is that in some sense it's limiting mechanical players' ability to exert themselves on the game. As in, if you think, okay, so in a game like Brood War, yes, we had players who could be fantastic at knowing like how to set up a trap, an engagement, and then win off having actually sometimes an inferior army. Like Savior was a great example of this. Or you could have people who overwhelmed you in terms of economy. So you could have someone like Alavuv, where he just out-macroed you, even if you were winning the small fights, But when you look at the mechanics of micro, there are players, I mean, a great example in Brood War would probably be the player Bisu, where just watching what he does with a few units in a key fight, he really can turn the game in his favor purely on the basis of that. Whereas if, if both players had agreed to just move the two armies into each other, he almost certainly would lose by the way the composition works and where he is in the game. Now, to contrast that to StarCraft 2, so a good friend of mine was the player Nanowar, the Swedish Protoss player. And I can tell you, this is something he really struggled with, because what would happen was he had fantastic, especially like individual unit micro. He had very, very good individual unit micro. And there are so many games that when I would discuss the outcome of the match afterwards, he would be like, I don't understand, like, I was winning the game, I was doing so well in this fight, and then when I would go back and watch the VOD to give him some feedback, I would say, well, you're right, actually, if you just look, like, if you look what the stream's looking at, okay, so we're zoomed in on the fight that you're doing with, like, this unit versus the other ones, right? In this particular scenario, you are out microing them, you're getting tiny little edges, but actually what you don't realize is, and this especially would happen against Zerg players, is that the other guy doesn't really care that you're getting like a 0.01% extra like efficiency out of your micro, because he's just A-moving the fucking lings into you and microing behind it, whereas you're actually not macroing behind it, whereas you're not macroing as much because you've put too much of your emphasis on the micro here. Right? What would you say to people who would say that that's a flaw of StarCraft 2? It doesn't really... You don't really reward the micro player as much, right?
Well, I think I think in that case, like I would kind of classify both macro and micro under like the ceiling of mechanics, and so I would say that it's an example where StarCraft 2 places, I think StarCraft 1 as well, places a lot of emphasis on it basically places a lot of power in macro, and it's very important to macro correctly. One of the differences I think that you see between the two games is that in StarCraft 2, you can focus a lot on micro and still macro behind. Like you can do a drop and that takes one action because the unit's path correctly and all that. And then you can hit a hotkey and then you can, mash a button and then you macro behind it. And so because macro is relatively more streamlined, it's much more important to macro constantly than it is, I guess to put it this way, there's less excuse, I guess, for not macroing correctly when you're microing. Like in Brood War, you kind of make this trade-off where, if like, for example, if I think Lelouch said this, he said, if you try to drop in Brood War like Innovation does in StarCraft 2, you'd be floating 10,000 minerals. Yes. Whereas in StarCraft 2, you should basically never be floating that many minerals because the macro has been streamlined to an extent that there's nothing that you can do in the game that gets you enough value to drop the macro side of the game. So that's kind of what I would say in response to that like specific example. I guess to address your broader question of whether it puts mechanical players at a disadvantage, I think that the method of skill differentiation comes down more to kind of identifying these small divergences in build orders and understanding changes in the meta as balance updates come in and kind of adapting to that. I think it's the emphasis on skill differentiation is more on that side of the game than it is on just like building stuff and moving stuff and attacking with stuff.
Okay. So as I referenced, the topic I wanted to talk about from this article, because the way you phrased it, I think was very different from how I've seen people describe it, was about the oversaturation coupled with how efficient just automatic mining is, basically. And the fact that as a result, you don't need as many bases to essentially be in almost an ideal situation or not put yourself at risk in StarCraft 2. Now, this should, on base level, be a fairly intuitive concept because people can understand if they've watched both games. Just everyone reaches max supply way faster in StarCraft 2. Like you need like the 3 or 4 bases and you need a solid like maybe 25, 30 minutes. And that depends if someone harasses you in Brood War before you're going to be at the max supply. And as such, you only really get to max supply in Brood War if other things have happened in the game. It's very rare you just both sit in your bases and go up like that. But first of all, in StarCraft, sometimes you do both sit in your bases and just macro up because it doesn't take as long. And then secondly, there's not going to be as much like, oh, should I start to expand here and take this base? If at this point in the game, there's no incentive. And so people will just get to what you kind of said is the soft cap of 3 bases. Unless something drastic happens or the game's really gone further, you don't really need to do more than that. Once you've done that, you've kind of met that condition. And now it's about looping back into what we said before, taking the right engagement, trying to set up a trap where you can trade off efficiently. What would you say on this topic? Because I have to say, as someone who's not a big fan of StarCraft 2, I think that actually outlines one of the biggest problems I had watching the game, is that I would see people sit there on a couple of bases, get to max supply, and then again it was just about, right, when these two armies move into each other, who has the better composition? Now, yes, there's small micro elements. Do they have the right units at the front of the composition or at the back? You know, how they're going to flank in? There's some elements. But generally, the reason why I think, for me, that caused a lot of games I didn't like watching is because then you just got into what I call I mean, it's just a kind of the boring dance of someone going backwards, someone going forwards, someone going backwards, someone going forwards, the other guy going backwards, the other guy going forwards, both looking for that perfect engagement because they know once the fight starts, it kind of just plays out and you watch it, right?
Well, I think that like one of the fundamental problems in RTS design is that you need to give players kind of an incentive to attack. And one of the observations I had when I played StarCraft 2 is when I started playing the game, people had this same criticism. They said like, it's too turtley, people sit in their base too much. And this is when Legacy was coming out and people were focusing on how Legacy tried to solve this problem. And I was sitting there in like Silver League, which if you don't know is like bottom 30% at the time. Sure. I was like, oh man, it's Silver League. You know, I'm always attacking. You know, these games, there's so much action in this game. I don't understand what the problem is. Until, you kind of, as you get better, you realize it's like, oh, actually, there's no reason to attack here, and there's no reason to attack there. And you suddenly realize, like, oh, all these times that I'm attacking, I should just sit in my base and macro up because there's no advantage to moving across the map. And I think that when you look back at pre-release interviews, Dustin Browder cites the biggest difference between StarCraft 2 and StarCraft 1 is mobility. And so I think that the designers made this conscious trade-off where they kind of took away the economic playstyle and they created the situation where you have this 3-base soft cap and they streamlined that. But at the same time, they tried to change the way that the game functions by making mobility very important and making it so that you could move your armies around very quickly. You could do a lot of damage very quickly. I think that the problem they ran into is that they didn't. It's a hard problem from a design perspective. And they didn't manage to really figure out how to do it until Legacy, and in particular until like recent Legacy. I think if you look at Legacy now, it features a lot more action than if you go back and look at games of Heart of the Swarm or Wings of Liberty. And I think it's because they finally figured out how to give players enough aggressive options and enough kind of attention distorting options such that you have an incentive to attack, because it's very difficult. There's suddenly so many things that you have to put up with as a defensive macro player. There's actually, in many ways, it's easier to attack and it's advantageous to attack rather than just sit in your base.
Okay. What do you think in StarCraft 2, when we talk about this element of like taking the right fights at the right time, but crucially with the right composition, that's also been another aspect of StarCraft 2 that, just from my perspective as, again, a complete layman, obviously I have no professional experience, so I wouldn't claim to be an expert on this topic. But one of the aspects that I found personally less interesting was I saw too many games where both players started out, they did what they could to scout each other, and then I watched the game, and it's not that I can say that the player who ended up picking the tech path that actually essentially won him the game made some amazing read and therefore did it in response to something. And sometimes it's not that the player who lost actually like failed to scout or didn't do a proper harassment, to know what was going on. Sometimes they just make tech path decisions which are somewhat semi in the dark or just by the numbers, like, 60% of the time I'm probably better off going with this here. And then they win the game. I wouldn't say entirely off that because that's too reductive, but largely off that. Whereas I don't feel as though that was the case as much in Brood War or some of the other RTS games I've seen. What would you say?
Gotcha. And so if I understand correctly, your impression is that basically players kind of pick build orders, or they pick strategic traversals kind of randomly, and then they just kind of win based on the coin flip of who picked what composition. Is that right? Especially
at certain points in the game, there'll be certain times where someone's made a tech switch, not necessarily because they've made some brilliant read. Whereas, like, for example, I mean, again, I'm a layman in Brood War as well, but I will say from watching top-level Brood War with the Koreans, there were a lot of amazing players who you almost couldn't beat them just by pure tech decisions, like unless you literally just did a mad all-in when they were doing the most greedy economy. There's obviously that, but generally, the really, really high-level Korean players had a lot of safe openings, which from that point, they are then going to make reads based on what they see in the game, and a lot of them can, as long as they can get to the 15-minute point. Now, if you beat them, you have to beat them by out-microing them, have better army control, out-macroing them, making some shrewd tech decision based on what their tech decision is. Am I being too reductive here? What's your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I didn't play StarCraft 2 during Heart of the Swarm and Wings of Liberty. It's something that I caught up on afterwards. So it's totally possible this was how the professional scene kind of functioned back during those years. My observation during Legacy is that I think the first map pool, you kind of saw some of this problem, especially on maps like Prey on Terraces, where like Zerg players got the gold immediately, and then like who knows what they would do after that. It was very unpredictable. But once the meta started getting figured out and people just started learning how to play the game, I haven't had that impression generally of Legacy. I feel that there have been some cases where players will kind of pick build order traversals that are wrong, and they'll lose in a quote unquote coin flip way. But it's usually that stems from like lack of good game understanding. The example that I think many people have cited in this case is the choice by Terran players in the TVP matchup as to whether they will proceed with kind of a 5-Rax 2-base all-in or whether they will go for a 3-base. Okay. And the insight there was that, well, you know, if the Protoss player goes Adept Phoenix, you probably shouldn't push in. You should just turtle, and you should wait for Adepts to be less useful because they're much less useful in the late game. And it's the idea here is that, well, maybe it's a coin flip for the Terran player to push into this or not. Like, how do you know how all in the Protoss is, I guess? And I think initially, I think a lot of Terran players were very salty about this and threatened to uninstall the game over this composition and so forth. But I think eventually people started to figure it out, and they started to make the right build order traversals based on what they were scouting from the Protoss. And they learned how to use the Reaper to create space. They learned how to, like, when to use scans and how to use scans. And this kind of over time got figured out. So okay. I guess my impression of the professional scene and the competitive scene has been a little bit different in that respect.
Okay, so when you outlined that some of these changes, as you can even see from the mouths of the people designing the game, even though they absolutely pay lip service, and in some cases I actually think some of them just aren't super in touch with the hardcore community, and so I think they genuinely are trying to make a game that works for hardcore players, but also for the casual player. I just think personally, because they're not as in-depth with the hardcore aspect, they're sort of incapable of that element, and so it ends up looking like they're just saying, well, we're doing both, but then I think the results tend to just skew that they're just fixing it, so in theory it's better for the casual player and just the everyday player. Now, the flaw I see with that is that I feel as though they might have just fallen in between the two positions as a result. And I would personally say that just makes the game a bit lukewarm to me. Like, that's why you have a world in which you have so many players who will tell you, I used to play StarCraft 2, but, you know, it got too boring, or I don't like to play it anymore. Well, that's the casual player, and then you have so many pro players. I've never seen a game that had a pro scene that behind the scenes when I talked to the pros, so many of them complained about the game. Like, the difference is in other games, they might complain about the balance or these aspects. I've heard so many players who were just like, you know, this game design element just basically means I don't like the game as much. So I feel as though in trying to appeal to both bases, which clearly have, to some degree, diametrically opposed interests, as we saw with the Vespene gas example, you know, where you basically can't make it ideal for both parties. It feels like they kind of fell between the two. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think there are several kind of elements to this problem. Like, I think at a very base level, like when you make a change in the game engine, let's say to change how units path, like that's going to affect everyone. And so if you make units path in a very intelligent way and reduce how much APM you need to manage unit pathing, that definitely affects the casual players in let's say a positive way, and maybe for like a very high level professional player looking to differentiate themselves from other players, maybe it affects them negatively, or maybe it doesn't have any impact. I think it kind of depends. But I think in many respects, the issue that StarCraft 2 has in the way that it approaches its casual and competitive scene is not necessarily its gameplay design, but really its product design. I think that it tries to solve the problems of casual players through gameplay design rather than solving it through product design. A good example is, like, it used to be at the beginning of Legacy, there would always be these mentions of like, well, we're balancing this unit because, like the Void Ray, for example, because, you know, players in lower leagues really like to mass this unit. And the question I would always wonder about is, like, I wonder whether these players would be happier, you know, playing in the arcade, let's say, than playing in Silver League. And maybe they would be happier playing Silver League. Like, that's fine.
Like play some sort of a mode that is about massing Void Rays, right?
Exactly. And I think StarCraft 2 has always struggled to push players to the modes that would match them most effectively. Before the arcade was recently revamped to be like a much superior overall product. But before, it was like very difficult to find game modes that would appeal to you. It was very difficult to find So like it took like 20 seconds to load. The user interface was very unintuitive. It just like, it didn't seem like StarCraft 2 went to the same like lengths, let's say, as older games where in an older game, like I remember in Age of Empires, like in Age of Empires 2, you had to play online on Microsoft Zone. And so to play online and play competitively, like you really had to work for it. Like you had to go out and seek that out. And so when I played Age of Empires 2, I mostly just played skirmishes with the AI because that was the huge, massive button in the middle of my screen that said, hey, this is how you should play the game. Okay. And so sometimes I wonder whether it's not necessarily the gameplay design that causes maybe it to fall in the middle. I think sometimes it just, the product design sometimes pushes casual players toward the ranked mode when maybe it would be better to push them towards other modes.
Okay. Well, along these lines then, I mean, you were kind of taking the emphasis there of how you could sort of cater to the casuals more. Here's the question that I don't think anyone's answered, and I don't think that StarCraft Brood War Remastered answers it. It's just kind of like, that seems to be a cash-in on nostalgia to me. Here's the question. When I read your article, it does seem like, while you identify these two, let's call them subgenres of RTS, ways of defining RTS games, as much as you define them like, you know, one can have this, one can have the other, it seems more like an evolution from one to the other. Like, do you think there is a world in which we will ever have, in esports or in a big esports context, a game that is emphasizing, to use your words, the real-time component of RTS, as opposed to this modern StarCraft 2 strategy element where you streamline a lot of the other elements? Do you think we'll ever get those types of older style games again?
I think so, yeah. Like, I think that there's one area of StarCraft 2's design that repeatedly comes up as a pain point for players, which is that the game is really fast. Like, it's possible in StarCraft 2, if you're not paying attention, to lose your entire army in just a matter of seconds if you're not looking and then someone rolls a bunch of banelings in, for example. And I mean, if you play it at above a certain level, that never happens. But it's just a fact of the game engine that if you don't position your units correctly and you're not paying attention, things tend to go very fast. And I've written before that StarCraft 2 runs very, very fast because it has to. Because it streamlines macro and micro to an extent that if you slowed the game down, even by, let's say, 5 or 10%, the top-level players would so quickly kind of perfect the game that many games would start becoming decided based on balance problems. The example that I usually cite here is the usage of Reapers by Bjorn. He practiced this strategy so much that he effectively by himself convinced Blizzard to nerf this unit over and over and over. But if you slowed the game down by 10%, you know, all of a sudden every good Terran player in the world would be microing like Bjorn, and it would feel like Zerg could never win against this matchup. Whereas in reality, it's just that Zerg could not beat Bjorn's Reapers. It's not that they couldn't beat Reapers in general. So I think that there is an open design question here as to, can you have a more modern game with kind of a modern user interface, but that doesn't run necessarily so fast? And I think that one possible solution to that is to slow the game down, but to kind of broaden the game out. So instead of, say, having like 3 bases, maybe you have 10 bases, or I don't know. I'm totally spitballing at this point, sure. But you kind of just like, you take something like, you take the middle point between Brood War and StarCraft 2 and you say, okay, well, maybe we'll make it so that, macro is still somewhat streamlined, but maybe there's like 6 different types of buildings now or something. Or maybe you have 30 different buildings and you have to go look at them. Or, you know, you can macro your bases, you can select all your bases at once, but you have 6 of them, so you have to go look at them a lot and so on and so forth. Okay.
Is the logic here that in the early game when you have the 2 bases, it's the same as StarCraft 2 now, but once you get up to the bigger late game scenario, you're kind of like bridging back to what Brood War had to a degree, right?
Exactly, and you would be bridging it in a way that solves a problem that existing StarCraft 2 players already have, which is that the game can sometimes feel too sudden or too fast. And so I think that would appeal to them as well, and it wouldn't necessarily alienate them and make them feel like, oh, we're regressing and going back to this old style of game that they don't like.
Okay. Right, usually on my channel, I'm not someone who does outros, but I did have a question that I thought I should pose to you as a final question, which is different from other people I have on this particular series, because most people who I feature on this series create almost the same type of content generally, and they've created it in the past and they're just going to create it again in the future. But obviously, since you approach such broad topics, and I know that because it's about game design more than specifically about StarCraft, for example, a lot of videos on your channel are to do with games that aren't considered esports games. So generally, if people want to hear more about this sort of content, design topics, how do you generally figure out, like, when you're going to do a StarCraft piece or when it's going to be a piece about a different game? How do you kind of balance it out? Are you just going at a whim?
So I create content to clarify my thinking, essentially. So I try to figure out, like, I try to ask a question and then I try to write an answer. I try to answer that using like a video or an article. And so, like, for example, this piece that we discussed today is like, why do StarCraft 2 players and Brood War players have this, like, what is the difference in user experience that causes them to have this like religious war between them?
Yes.
And so anytime I have like a compelling question that I feel is worth answering or that comes up in the community, I create content to try to answer it. And so I guess I guess in some ways you could say that I make content on a whim, but at the same time, I think I make content to try to answer questions that I think are important. And so anytime like for example, this new design patch recently came out, that was a source of a lot of different content that I made for StarCraft 2, because I think it poses some basic questions about what does it mean to maintain an RTS game 7 years after its release. Like, that's a really long time in RTS terms. So I guess none of that really answers your question. I guess I make content based on, yeah, I mean, I guess honestly you said it best. I guess I make it on a whim. I guess you're right about that.
Hey, this is Huck. If you want to watch this top 3 asshole keep doing esports content, subscribe to Thorin's YouTube channel.